Good afternoon to you all. My name is Jerabon Nelly Tutoek, a lawyer at KKK Advocates LLP and a former member of the AKMCC committee. I'd like to welcome you all to the 8th All Kenya Moot Court competition, where the theme of this year's competition is the rule of law, ensuring government accountability for the protection of human rights. The All Kenya Moot Court competition is a competition that has been organized by the students of Kenyatta University School of Law and the sponsors and the associates for the competition, where students of law all over Kenya contribute and deliberate on the issues that affect students and generally the people of Kenya during in the legal profession. And this webinar comes at a timely manner as we celebrate Kenya at 10, the Constitution at 10 years, hashtag Katiba at 10. And as Kenyans, we need to ask ourselves, what have we achieved throughout this 10 years, and have we really achieved what we set out to achieve 10 years ago? And I'd like to take us back to the webinar we had on Monday, 24th of August 2020, where we talked about the rule of law, and we talked about how the rule of law has really affected the day-to-day activities that we have. Sorry for that. I'd like to take you back to the first webinar we had on Monday, the 24th of August 2020, where we talked about enforcement of court orders and the problems that the judiciary has been facing. We had several distinguished members of our profession joining us, including Justice Weldon Farid, who talked about the implication of the disregard of court orders. Secondly, we had Mr. Nelson Harvey, the president of the Law Society of Kenya, who talked about the role of advocates in implementation of court orders, and he referred to the over 200 court orders that have not been implemented to date and that have been blatantly disobeyed by various officers of the country. He also referred to not only the court orders that are being disregarded. He also looked at various members of the government, especially high levels of government. Victor Kamau, the Deputy Director of KNCR, who talked about the importance of standing firm and the importance of citizens to continue urging government to uphold their rights as citizens. We also had Professor Kia, civil society in the implementation of court orders, and finally we had webinar continue.
And welcome once again session. So as my colleague Nelly has mentioned, we're actually celebrating Katiba 10 and the protection it has towards the right to accessible and adequate housing under Article 43. But as we celebrate Katiba 10, we continue to see forced evictions still taking place in our country, especially during a pandemic when staying at home has been the most effective strategy towards protecting ourselves from contracting COVID-19. Of bigger concern is the utter disregard of court orders to halt evictions by senior officials. This was experienced in May during the Kariobangi North evictions, where more than 7,000 families were actually rendered homeless. The presidential moratorium on forced evictions during this COVID-19 period has also fallen on deaf ears, with the PS of the Ministry of Water and Sanitation actually announcing his plans to repossess land in 6 areas in order to expand the water and sewerage projects. If these plans are actually to go ahead and be implemented without adhering to the UN basic principles and guidelines on development-led evictions, we'll see scores of families and communities being rendered homeless. So during today's session, we want to engage with different stakeholders at different capacities who will speak about the general overview of the legal framework governing evictions in Kenya. We'll also speak about the initiatives of IPOA in combating police excessive use of force and brutality during evictions. We'll also try and engage with the civil society in how they work towards ensuring police don't use excessive force. And lastly, we'll talk about protecting the right to adequate housing during evictions. So we actually call our viewers to engage with us on our Twitter and Facebook and YouTube channels. So on Twitter, please follow us using the handle AKMCC8 and also hashtag due process and evictions. On Facebook and YouTube, you can watch us through All Kenyan Moot Court competition. And with this, I'll allow Nelly to introduce our panelists for today's session. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Lavender. As we begin our webinar today, I'd like to urge you all to remember that Kenya, as a democratic country, is a country governed by the rule of law, and that the rule of law is important to maintain the fabric of our society and to also ensure that the social covenants that we have as the citizens and the leaders of our country is maintained. So I'd like to begin by welcoming Honorable Justice Kosibor, who will be joining us as the first panelist and will leave us shortly afterwards. So in case you have any questions for her, kindly stand as we continue with as she continues with her first speech so that we can ask her before she leaves. So thank you. Welcome, Honorable Justice.
Thank you.
Thank you. You can begin. Tell us how do you think we should. You can begin with your topic of the general overview of the legal framework governing evictions in Kenya. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. You want me to go ahead?
Yes, kindly go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I first start by correcting. I think what you sent out, you said I'm a High Court judge. I am not a High Court judge. I serve in the Environment and Land Court. I am in Milimani, Nairobi. And that is the reason I will be overview of the law on evictions, not because I am rude or ill-mannered or because I don't take this session very seriously, but it's for the simple reason that you're going to be discussing live cases. You're going to be discussing cases that are before us in court. So I am sorry, I will not sit through all of it because we have live cases in court. And the opinions I express here, I am sure at some point there'll be applications in court to say I should disqualify myself from hearing matters. So please understand and bear with me. So I'll basically take you straight away to section 152A up to I of the Land Act 2012. I believe these amendments were brought in 2016. And then there were land regulations made in 2017 that deal with evictions. That basically summarizes the law on evictions. So section 152 of the Land Act starts by saying that warning people not to unlawfully occupy private, community, or public land. But in the event that persons occupy private, community, or public land, and this is the law that will be followed in evicting them. So an unlawful occupant of private, community, or public land should be evicted in accordance with this law. And if it is public land, the National Land Commission is required to issue an eviction notice to all the persons who are affected. That would be the persons who are deemed to be unlawfully occupying the public land. And that notice should be written. It will appear in the Kenya Gazette. And in one newspaper that circulates in just one specific region. And they'll also give it in a local language. So assuming the land to be, from which people are supposed to be evicted is in, you know how many tribes in Kenya, and we know the regional spread. So they will have to issue a notice on that specific area. And this is, the notice should be not less, should be not less than 3 months. So it means you should give at least a minimum of 3 months. So if you were to be given 2 months, that is wrong. The law says 3. At least 3. Now, if the land evicted is unregistered, executive committee member in that county in charge of lands is the one to issue the notice, shall cause the decision that has been taken to evict people from the unregistered community land. So he will cause that notice to be brought to the attention of those affected. The notice should be in writing, is it? One newspaper of nationwide circulation and a radio announcement. I am imagining here, if the area is predominantly somewhere in Makueni, then you don't expect them. Kisii, in Eke there, especially the ones who are supposed to be evicted. The whole point is to bring it to their attention that they are going to, so that if they want, they can take steps to go to court. And I will shortly tell you what the court can do. If it is registered community land or private land, and you're occupying someone's private land without their consent, then the landowner will serve a notice on the persons occupying the land, and it should also not be less than 3 months. The notice should be given, it should give you more than 3 months notice to vacate the land. And in the case where it is a registered community land and private land, that notice should be in writing, and official language. That means in both English and Kiswahili of people who are living in that place. The notice should be published in 2 daily newspapers.
Just a second, we're not able to hear.
Population, the ones that are not in strategic location and where the area. The whole point is to bring it to their attention that there's a threat of eviction.
Since we've lost Honorable Justice, maybe I would suggest, as we wait for her to return, we could move
About that, I am here.
Oh, we can hear you.
So you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
You can maybe just switch off your video. I think that would be much better. If
I switch off my video.
That would be much better for you.
Is that better?
That's much better. And continue.
Sorry. So the notice that they served should be published in 2 newspapers and be put in 5 strategic positions. And the notice should specify other conditions like requiring the person to remove livestock, to remove plants, like if you have planted your beans or maize and all those issues. Then after the notice has been served, that notice should also be served upon the Deputy County Commissioner in charge of that area and the OCPD in that area. Now, after being served with the notice of eviction, those who are affected and are threatened with eviction are required to move to court and basically to challenge the notice of the eviction. The expectation here is that they will move within those 3 months or the period within which they've been given, which is why it's important that that notice is brought to their attention. And the court will consider the matter, and it can take several steps. The court could confirm the notice and order the persons to vacate the land. The court may cancel, vary, alter, or make additions to the notice of eviction, or it may also impose terms it deems equitable and just. The court may suspend the operation of the notice for any period which the court determines, and the court could also order for compensation. Now, from the court point of view, of course, for you to get to the point where you issue these orders, it would mean you will give them, you will ask them to go and serve the other party who is threatening to evict them. And the normal court procedures, of course, would have to follow. And the tendency usually is that if in the pleadings they have sought an injunction to restrain the evictions, then the court may give the injunction, in which case after that it now falls upon the judge and the court to basically do the case in the normal manner. You know, there are many other cases, so you don't expect like this is going to be heard within 3 months, but I'm sure from time to time the parties will apply for an extension of those orders. Then after that has happened, in the event that the eviction still proceed, if the court does not stop them based on the powers the court has under section 152F, then the law provides for the manner in which the evictions should be carried out. First of all, it should be preceded by the people who've come to carry out the evictions, identifying themselves. So it should not be a rowdy mob arriving with machetes and all the other things. It should be people who arrive there and they identify themselves, and they should have authority. Now, the identification required under Regulation 66 is that they need to produce their national identity cards, their official or staff cards, the letter of authorization from either the owner or the National Land Commission if it is public land. After identifying themselves, and they need to present the authorization that they have. And I have mentioned that the authorization would either come from the owner or the public land, National Land Commission if it is public land. Now that authorization should be written, and of course, if it is unsurveyed, unregistered, sorry, If it is an unregistered community land, it is the CEC for land who should issue that authorization. That is Regulation 67. That authorization should have been copied to the national government administrators in that specific county where the eviction is supposed to take place, and it should also be copied to the OCPD. That's Regulation 67 under the Land Regulations 2017. Now, after identifying themselves and presenting the authorization, then there's also the manner in which the evictions should be done. And if it is a group of people who are involved, who are supposed to be evicted, as in more than one person or probably more than one family, this is, I guess, mostly like where it is public land or somebody has a large tract of land, then you need to have government officials or representatives of those groups present during the eviction. The eviction should be carried out in a manner that respects the dignity, right to life, and security of those affected. So as they carry out those evictions, they must pay due regard to the dignity of the persons being evicted, their right to life. Basically, this means, of course, there should be no loss of life during evictions. And then the security of those affected should be taken into consideration. Those coming to carry out the evictions should include special measures to ensure the protection of vulnerable people in our society, like the women in the area where they're evicting people from, children, the elderly, and persons with disabilities. I am thinking of a scenario here where there's somebody on a wheelchair, and of course they cannot run quickly during evictions. Usually there's mayhem. So those who are carrying out the evictions should take such into consideration. If they're small children, just make sure they have been removed from the scene completely. You can imagine trying to come in with earth movers and there are children, or there's a man on a wheelchair or a woman who is disabled and cannot move and run away from that place. Then they should also include measures to ensure that there is no deprivation of property or possessions during the evictions. In essence, evictions don't license you to go and have a mob so that they can loot property. During the evictions, they should not deprive those people of their property. Whatever they're going to manage to carry from there, don't bring, basically provide security so there's no looting of people's personal property. And then even as they move, because of course at that point it is inevitable they have to be moved by force. Evictions, of course, are not force. Then the possessions and other property left behind involuntarily should not be destroyed. So assuming you are moving people from this place and they can only carry what they can salvage at that point, whatever they leave behind should not be destroyed. So whoever is carrying out the evictions should have mechanisms to protect the property and other possessions which will be left out involuntarily. And then they must respect the principles of necessity and proportionality during the use of force. If they're going to use force during the evictions, they must respect the principles of necessity. It must be absolutely necessary. And then proportionality. I am sure I had in the panel people who will be talking about that. So I will leave that to them. And then they should give the affected persons the first priority to demolish and salvage their property. I'm looking at it like if the houses from which they're being evicted are made of mabati and made of wood, then they should be given an opportunity to pull down the houses, the materials, the building materials, hopefully so that even where they go, they can go and start life when they have the iron sheets and they have the wood. So they should be given the first priority, the ones affected, not the looters, to pull down the structures and salvage whatever property they can. Then that section gave the cabinet secretary the power to prescribe regulations to give effect to the section. And those are the regulations I have mentioned to you, Land Regulations 2017. And 7 days after the eviction, the commission, that's the National Land Commission where it's public land, or the county government, or the CEC where it is, and it is registered community land, or the private owner of the land, 7 days, moved whatever land through and disposed of through public auction. If there's any property there that was not collected after the eviction, that basically gives the people who've been evicted some space. Assuming you're evicted on Monday, then you have 7 days to go back and collect whatever was left. In essence, I think this imposes on whoever is evicting the responsibility to provide security, so sort of to cordon off the area from which people have been evicted, so that during that period, whoever was evicted and managed to carry away very little can come back and carry the 7 days after the eviction will be sold. Whatever is not claimed will be sold by public auction. And 152I, if the person who unlawfully occupied that land had erected buildings or any other works on this land from which they are being evicted without the consent of the owner, then the competent officer, is it competent officer? Yes, shall order the person who erected that within a reasonable period to remove it. I'm imagining here that whoever is being evicted left double-storied structure that is made of maybe stone. So I think in that sense, the owner of the land is going to give them time to remove at their expense whatever structure they had put up on this land, which is not, which they were unlawfully occupying. So that basically sums up, gives the overview of the law on evictions. I have touched on the regulations, and I think there's a form under the Land Act now based on the regulations. There's form LF 57 in the third schedule, which basically covers what the notice should have, the notice the landowner is giving to the people who are scheduled to be evicted. Now, most importantly, Regulation 68. Evictions are supposed to be carried out between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. This can only be Kenyan time. During evictions, the evictees are supposed to be allowed to carry their personal possessions, and whatever is left behind should not be destroyed. That I think is also captured in the Act, but the rules, the regulations specify these a lot more. Yes. Thank you very much. I hope there are no questions.
Thank you, Justice Board. That was a very enlightening presentation. Thank you for taking us through the procedures according to the Land Laws Amendment Act with regards to public land. And at least now it's quite clear what needs to be considered before, during, and after an eviction. Maybe we could just see what questions before you leave. We just check if there are any questions for you. So there's a question by Rose Kimotho, who asks, what if the community land is not yet registered? I don't know, maybe I should read all the questions and then you could just give us responses for them. We also have a question by Elvis Obok, who asks, my question to the Honorable Judge is this: where a person served an evictions notice does not move to court within the 3 months and the notice lapses, is there still a need for the owner of the land to obtain an evictions order from the court, or is the evictions notice sufficient? Then we have another question, which specific regulations are this? I think you made it clear, the Land Laws Amendment Act. And then the final question is, what time limit is regulated for demolition process? So I'm not sure if this is with regards to how long the evictions notice should cover, but perhaps you could just give us an overview of responses to these questions.
The regulations I was referring to are called Land Regulations 2017. And they basically are regulations under the Land Act. So they cover different sections of the Land Act, which required the Cabinet Secretary to formulate regulations. The ones dealing with evictions I mentioned run from 63 to 69. The question about from Rose Kimotho, if it is not registered community land, then that is the CEC. That is the County Executive Committee member responsible for land. That is the one to cause the decision for the eviction to be published in the manner I spoke about. So why it is not registered land, it is the CEC in charge of land matters. Then if the notice lapses, is it sufficient that a notice had been issued? Can I avoid answering that question? It's a live matter in court. But just read the rules again. Then I think the last one was within what period should, what was it? Within what period of time should somebody remove their building, or what was that?
So the last question is regard to what time limit is regulated for the demolition process. And I'm not quite sure what the participant was seeking to ask, but my assumption is with regards to the evictions notice, how long the evictions notice should be given.
The eviction notices, I think the law says minimum of 3 months. In terms of demolition, it just says whoever is giving the notice for demolition, the competent officer, should specify in the order. I would want to imagine here it has to be a reasonable period of time. You would take a shorter time to demolish a smaller structure than if it was a very big, long structure, because I mean, you have to take into consideration the building materials used. If you have concrete, if you have a mixture of, it's actually called concrete. The one you have metal and the mixture, and it has settled. It will take much longer to demolish, like, it's called a slab, a building with a slab compared to one without a slab. So I would want to think it should take a reasonable time, really, based on the structure that is in place. But Elvis Obok, if you were to look at 152, if somebody doesn't go to court after being served with an eviction notice and it complies with what the law requires, then I guess after that, really, you should proceed and carry out the eviction, but in strict accordance with the law. I don't think that would entitle you to go and evict somebody at night. Please still evict them between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. in the evening. So you would still have to comply with the rest of the law on evictions. I hope that was the last question. I am avoiding being drawn to respond to questions that we will need to decide in court.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I feel very jittery to answer some questions.
I think that was very smooth regulations and the laws that govern eviction processes. And one of the things that really stood out for me was that it's very important to respect the dignity, the right
Yes.
to life of persons who have been evicted. So as we go on to the next presenter, we really thank you, Judge, for joining us for this session, and thank you for answering our questions. I think Lavender can introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Judge Bor, and it was really nice having you. So our next panelist is Mr. Irungu Houghton. He's the Executive Director of Amnesty International, and he's going to take us through the protection of the right to adequate housing during evictions. Welcome, Mr. Irungu Houghton.
Thank you very much, and Honourable Justice, just to say what a pleasure it was to listen to you. I do realize as organizations committed to human rights protection that perhaps we have not followed all the levers of the law, and I think it's the leadership of you and other judges that really generates this consciousness in society in terms of where the law lies, and just to thank you. Abigail and Lavender, thank you very much, and to my fellow panelists. Let me also start with an apology in the sense that I will speak and then have to leave you and come back towards the end of the session. And I think there are a couple of things I wanted to say. You know, Justice, what was very interesting, she talked about, you know, the eviction hours can only happen between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. and that is Kenyan time. It's not any other Pacific time or any part of the world. But I think the other thing that struck me really is I listened to, you know, all the provisions that exist under the law to protect people's rights from forced evictions and from the demolition of their homes. It did strike me that, you know, in the joke that you made that this is Kenyan time, that this, you know, it seems to me like this is Kenyan law, or even that is somehow an interesting comment, that our experience as Amnesty over the last 3 years, at least, if not going back to 2014, is that many of these provisions are not followed. And I could go into this in a lot of detail just to give you a sense of how that works. But if I think about the 2014 evictions of the indigenous people, the Sengwe from Embabut Forest in Elgeyo Marakwet, and all the damage that was done by the Kenya Forest Services to have them evicted from their ancestral lands, and really that history, 100-year history of indigenous people being slowly moved from lands where they have their shrines, where they have their traditional, production systems, and also where they have freely conserved forests for decades. That they lost that right in 2014. They lost it in 2018, and more recently we saw evictions happening for the Sengwe, and I can mention also the Ogiek and other indigenous communities, and that experience is very different from anything that you've just described as being the law. I think the second, comment was, the experience was really the work we did around Kibra and the evictions of the Kibrans from the 4 of the 11 Kibra villages, Mashmoni, Lindi, Camp Muru, and Kisumundogo. That these communities, upwards of, I think it was in the range of about 30,000 people, I walked personally behind the tippers and the building equipment that was used to just vacate humanity in order to make way for the link road between Gong Road and Langata. And again, just wondered, how is it possible that urban community displacement in the age of the 4 Jubilee pillars could be so brutal, so direct? And our investments in infrastructure development, billions of shillings of investments. These are not cheap investments. These are highly resourced investments, sometimes by the international community, but many of times it's by government, that these infrastructural developments will displace tens of thousands of people, and not just their homes, but their clinics, their schools. And if anybody who has gone through this experience of having your home, or talked to anybody who has had this experience of having your home destroyed, what you realize is actually it is not just a home. It is your very identity. It is the documents that you need to survive. It is the safety and the dignity that comes with a shelter over your head. It is all the investments that you have made. And it is, of course, the direct danger that it poses to people with disabilities and children, as the Justice mentioned earlier on. I think the third experience really has been in 2020. And we have been engaged, we were engaged in the Kariobangi North case, the Ruai case. We hear that there are additional cases that have been placed, for action, particularly in terms of the introduction of water and sanitation systems across Nairobi and also in Mombasa and other places. And one wonders, and we have had this representation at the highest level of the government, one wonders, how is it possible that we could even be thinking about forced evictions at a time like COVID-19, much less within the context of the guidelines that we have and that Justice Bohr and her colleagues essentially look at from time to time. So I think the issue of proportionality, the issue of respect, the issue of dignity, in many cases that we have been involved in Amnesty just doesn't seem to matter. It just doesn't matter. And I think the challenge for the 70 of us on this call is really, how do we create a muscle in this country that says that this must not happen? This must be stopped, and people must be protected from essentially losing one of the most fundamental rights that they have, which is the right to housing. So I'm going to stop there and leave you with the words of a woman that I interviewed just minutes after the bulldozers went through Kibera. And she said, "We are not against development. We just want our livelihoods and our rights to be respected as well." And she ended by this comment: or are we children of a lesser God than other Kenyans? And I think that is the challenge for this afternoon, in terms of how do we generate a debate that is interesting, but secondly, a debate that actually leads to action in protection of people's rights. I thank you very much.
For the enlightening presentation. I think what stood out for me is the fact that we acknowledge that we do have provisions that protect us from forced evictions, and yet they continue to be disregarded. And this is not just for urban communities, but also we see it with the indigenous people with regards to the ancestral land. Another issue that you really brought out was that evictions don't only destroy homes, but they actually they damage livelihoods and also the dignity of those people living in these areas. And the last thing that I think was really striking is during a pandemic, a time when you'd think the state would have some kind of humanity, is it continues to conduct forced evictions. And you've challenged all of us how we can take action, how we can speak about the issue of forced evictions. When will Kenyans, be outraged? When will we, stand up and say enough is enough? We need to protect our homes. We need to protect our livelihoods, and lastly, we need to protect our dignity. So I'll just open up to the participants to see if we have any questions for you before you leave.
Unfortunately, I do have to go because I'm moderating another session. So I would request you, please do take questions and I will respond to them. But if you can give me an hour or so to discharge that responsibility and come back.
That's perfectly fine. So I think currently we don't have any questions. I'll allow my colleague Nelly to introduce our next participant. Thank you, Irungu.
Thank you again, Mr. Irungu. Really, our homes are our identities. Really thank you for joining us today. Our next presenter will be Mr. Abi Juma, Policy and Advocacy Manager at IJM, and he'll be taking us through the place of civil society in combating police excesses and brutality during eviction. Welcome, Mr. Abi.
Kindly admit yourself.
Sorry. Good afternoon to the moderators, my fellow panelists. I see my senior, Mr. David Derito, with us here. Good to see you, sir. And even Mr. Irungu Houghton. As IJM, it is an honor for us to participate in this session of the All Kenya Moot Court competition. I think this is our third, if not fourth year, participating in this activity in collaboration with the Kenyatta University and all partnering university. It's also a pleasure to see you, Nelly. I think when we started this, you were part of the team, and I see you're still at it, together with my colleague, Timothy Thondu. who also participated heavily in ensuring that we came to know about the All Kenya Moot Court competition. I think a lot has been said concerning the issue of evictions in this country. And I think I'll just narrow mine a bit to the challenges that we have seen as civil society when it comes to evictions of Kenyans, which are done in manners that are less than the law requires. And I'll start from a background of the culture of impunity that is very evident in all these cases of evictions that continue to be shared, that we continue to see in mass media. And I want to speak about that vis-a-vis the culture of respect for rule of law. And what we see, if you want to get a defining factor of each of these evictions that we have seen over the last so many years, is the issue of arbitrariness. You cannot tell at what point a landowner will be evicted from their land. At some point, we used to think that it was somebody without a title. We have seen people with title deeds being evicted. At some point, we used to think a government entity cannot be evicted. We've even seen those ones. And so the common theme around evictions has turned out to be arbitrariness. And that has gotten to a point where even the sanctity of title, the fact that you hold a title deed to a land on which you reside, is not something that is respected by the powers that be. We've seen in this country, one government issuing title deeds to Kenyans, to poor Kenyans who save, who give their lifetime savings to purchase land, and then a succeeding government coming in and revoking those titles without any recourse to the victims who end up losing a lot of their hard-earned money. The issue of removal from land in a manner that respects dignity and in a manner that is humane has been spoken about by the Honorable Learned Judge, and I'll not get into that because it was quite well elaborated. But I'd like to narrow down to the role that the police play when it comes to evictions specifically, but how they play that role broadly. I know my senior, Mr. Nderitu, will come in and will give even more details on how we are holding, as a country, police accountable through the Civilian Oversight Authority, that is IPOA. And so I'll not get so much into that. I'll speak to what civil society actors are doing to try to ensure that the public is protected from such cases. Now, I think while much has been said, the role of the police when it comes to evictions and generally is to ensure the promotion of respect for rule of law and the maintenance of order. Those two aspects. And just by looking at the way evictions have been conducted in this country, those two aspects seem to have been pushed to the periphery. And the reason I say that is this: how are you observing the law when you're evicting people who have valid titles? And even if they do not have titles, we've seen people who've been evicted, yet there is a valid court order that has been pronounced. And a court order in this country is law by dint of the Judicature Act, Section 3, subsection 1. And yet we see people being evicted, and even at times that are not proper, that are not sanctioned by law. And I think when you look at most of these cases that have been spoken about, and some that we even know about, most of the evictions happen from around 3 a.m. And so how are you observing order when you're evicting women and children as young as, you know, a few months old, a few days old, from their homes in the middle of the night? And in the process, even maiming some of them. We've seen people who have died as a result of evictions. So how is that observing order? And as we know, the National Police Service is a disciplined service, and it operates under a strict chain of command, or so we are made to believe. Now, this indicates that an officer on the ground operates based on orders from above, especially when it comes to something like evictions. And so for them to be deployed in the droves that we see, evicting hundreds of homes, then such deployments cannot be arbitrary. They cannot be as a result of a random decision by a senior officer seated somewhere. It should be something that is sanctioned by law, which most of the time we do not see. And when these orders from above are issued in a manner that is contrary to a court order, or in a manner that is contrary to the law, and the Honorable Justice has clearly stated what the law is, then such orders are illegal. And as civil society, what we do is to try and ensure that there is systemic policy change so that such illegal orders will not have the force of law within the police structure. So when we are involved in systemic policy change, what we do is we track laws, policies, and the operational space. That is the implementation of what police officers do to ensure that they promote the rule of law, they promote human rights, rather than being, so to say, perpetrators of human rights violations. And so we want to get to a place where a person should be protected if they are on the right side of the law. Secondly, what the civil society do is that we intervene in individual cases to try and ensure accountability and to ensure that perpetrators of violations are held to account. And in doing this, we partner with government. And government includes institutions such as IPOA, institutions such as the National Police Service Commission, the National Police Service itself, the Internal Affairs Unit, which is a unit within the National Police Service, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, and in other cases, even the judiciary. And so this is to ensure that when we see a case of violation taking place, and it is something that is as a result of a gap in law, or something that comes about as a result of disregard for law, then we try to ensure that whatever gap there was, or whatever opportunity occasioned the disregard for law, is then sealed, so that in future, another officer or the same officer will not find that opportunity to go and become a perpetrator and have a system that is encouraging him to do that. So in closing, I'd just like to say that what we do is predominantly those two: systemic policy change and intervention in individual cases. Now, how we come about this varies. Sometimes it is in the form of demonstrations, sometimes it is in the form of strategic litigation, sometimes it is the form of partnership with government, but all these are aimed at reducing the space in which misconduct or human rights violations, including evictions, take place. With those few remarks, I'd like to take this back to the moderators. In case there's any questions, I'm happy to respond.
Thank you, Andrew, for that detailed and important session that you just took us through. We're really glad that you took the opportunity to come and join us today, and we're continually for joining AKMCC each year for the past 4 years, and we thank you for continually advocating for the rights of the law. So one of the things I really resonated in your presentation, you talked about systemic policy change and the intervention in individual cases. And with that, I believe we'll have the next speaker before we have questions to you, Mr. Abel. So we'll have Lavender kindly introduce the next speaker.
Okay, thank you, Nelly. So moving on, we'll have Mr. David Nderitu, who is the Director of Complaints and Legal Services at IPOA. He will be speaking about the initiatives by IPOA in combating police excesses and brutality during evictions. Welcome, Mr. David Nderitu.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for that. Thank you very much. First and foremost, I want to thank moderators and the program in general for finding time and space to invite me, and on behalf of IPOA for that matter. Also, the presenters who have already done it, at least 3 of them, and also the participants. I was supposed to be here this afternoon with my lieutenant, Mr. Festus Kinoti, who is our head of legal services. Unfortunately, he is on a well-deserved and earned annual leave, and therefore he will not be with us today. I want, in my presentation, first and foremost, to pose a few questions so that, particularly learning from what has already been said by my predecessors, and ask ourselves, number one, if the eviction is legal, then the question first becomes, why would anyone want to occupy land or premises or property that does not belong to them? And number two, and the judge captured this very well, what are some of the places where we find people being evicted? And number three, I also want to make a comment on the sanctity of a title deed, as has been captured by Mr. Njuma some moments ago. Land in this country generally and property is a very emotive issue and topic. We have had fights and wars, almost breaking into civil war and anarchy related to land. For those who are good historians, we have documented evidence for the 1992 crisis, 1997, which appear almost to run parallel to every election or electoral cycle in this country. But I think the type of evictions we are talking about mainly is where people have occupied land that does not belong to them, and more particularly, people we would call of the lower kanda or the lower classes or the lower echelons of our society. And why people occupy land that does not belong to them, mainly in the third world, Africa close and across the Caribbean and other places in Asia, is mainly due to poverty. Mainly due to poverty. Most of these people are hopeless and helpless in the sense that they don't have a roof over their heads. Some of them have nowhere to go. Some of them have been born and brought up in the streets, and they find themselves in what we call informal settlements or slums, and therefore in the process end up occupying land that does not belong to them. Therefore, if we want first and foremost to eliminate the issue of talking about forced or illegal or unlawful evictions, maybe we would do a lot of good to ourselves to address the issue of human rights all the way from socio-economic and political rights. But that is a discussion for another day, but I think that is good food for thought. So that when we start talking about right to property, right to a home, right to food, right to health, social amenities, education, etc., then that's the only time probably we would start taking this matter seriously. But that said, there are also other people who occupy other people's land out of greed. Out of greed. People just want to own land and occupy land, and therefore there could also come in forced eviction. The other one, of course, is impunity. There are people in this country, and it has been said, over 200 court orders not obeyed by sometimes government agencies, sometimes individuals in their personal capacity or in the public offices that they occupy, and you can see an element of impunity. Likewise, there are people who occupy other people's land because they have no regard for rule of law, justice, etc., etc. But which areas, mainly in Kenya, have we found people being forced out of or forced evictions? We have areas we call water towers. We have areas we call catchment areas, like Mau. We have other people who have occupied road reserves. We also have people who have occupied forests. And also, of course, we have other people who have occupied what we would properly call a private land. But as Agli has rightly pointed out, there is what we call sanctity of a title deed. However, for a title deed to enjoy that sanctity, then it must be a lawfully obtained document. A forged title deed or a title deed that has been obtained fraudulently cannot be said to enjoy any sanctity. And therefore, when we talk about this entire topic of evictions in Kenya, we have to be cognizant of all what encompasses this, including the issue of, and most important and relevant to our discussion today, human rights. Because the issue of forced evictions is an issue of human rights under Chapter 4 of our Constitution. Respect for dignity, rights of ownership of property, right to land, right to food, right to education, etc., etc. But in the interest of time, let me narrow down to what I was called upon to discuss today. And I was called upon today to discuss the role of IPOA, where IPOA finds itself, or what IPOA should do in circumstances where we have people being evicted, and more so illegally, and particularly what is the role of the police. I wish the moderator and the program had invited the National Police Service. They have able lawyers I've met, and I know they would also have been able to raise a voice and tell us why things sometimes don't go the way they are supposed to be. First and foremost, I want to mention Articles 1, 2, and 3 of our Constitution about the sovereignty of the people of Kenya, the issue of supremacy of the Constitution, and also that under Article 3, we must all act in defense of the Constitution and therefore the rule of law. And in there, if you look at Article 244, it says that our police, our National Police Service must at all times act in a professional and disciplined manner. And in Article 239, sub-Article 5 of our Constitution, it is stated that all security organs in this country are actually subject to civilian sovereignty, again relating to Article 1. And therefore, IPOA was created in 2012 under the IPOA, under the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, for the purposes of oversighting the police. Why oversight the police? Because up to that point, particularly those who can remember the 2007, 2008 elections, post-election violence, you remember that the police was condemned to a large extent for having taken sides. Other people felt they did not play their role, and therefore it was found necessary, just like we oversight almost everything else, that even the National Police Service should be oversighted by a civilian body, because at the end of the day, under Article 1, the sovereign power belongs to the people. And under sections 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the Independent Policing Oversight Authority Act, number 35 of 2011, IPOA was created. And section 4 of that act talks about the independence of the authority as far as executing their functions is concerned, that the authority should not be under the direction of any person or institution. Section 5 talks about the objectives of the authority. Section 6 talks about the functions, and Section 7 talks about the powers of the authority in execution of their duty. But let me break it down and sort of condense it in very simple language that all of us can understand, even those who do not have the act in front of them to make reference. IPOA does 3 major things. The 3 major things are these. 1, IPOA is supposed to receive complaints. Anyone who has any complaint against any member of the National Police Service or the National Police Service as an institution, the place to lodge your complaint is at IPOA. And in most cases, when there are evictions that are unlawful, people will come to IPOA and lodge a complaint. What else are we supposed to do? Number 2, we are supposed to monitor operations of police. Where police are involved, where members of the public will come into contact with the police, IPOA should be there so that we can see, are the police being professional? Are they disciplined in executing their mandate? IPOA again comes in there. Number 3, we have powers to investigate that misconduct or criminal conduct by the police and take the appropriate action. And in most cases, the appropriate action where we disclose, where the investigation discloses that there was criminal misconduct, whether by way of injury or death, IPOA is supposed to submit that file to the DPP so that the member of the National Police Service concerned is prosecuted accordingly. In fact, even members of the National Police Service themselves, if they have complaints against their employer in terms of conduct that is unlawful, they are welcome to report to IPOA. And therefore, what has IPOA done as far as unlawful evictions are concerned? 1, we have received complaints where people say we were harassed, we were injured, we lost a member of the family, and we have investigated these matters. And since some of them are pending in court, I do not want to mention particular cases. Number 2, we have monitored, as I have said, a number of these evictions. We were at Mau in 2018. We were also in Canberra in 2018 when people were being removed along the rail line. And in that one, we were able to observe the police behaved in a very professional way, I would say, from the report that I have. And there was nothing to probably write so much home about, except for small matters like identification of police officers, etc., etc. In Mau, we went there only to find that the people who are on the ground and who are evicting, the people were mainly members of the Forest Service. Unfortunately, under our act, we do not have mandate over those. We have also had situations where councillors carries, the so-called county government enforcement department, are engaged in evictions. Again, we do not have mandate over those. And therein probably comes the problem. But as far as we see it from this end, we have open channels where people can get in touch with us through emails, through the social media, through our website, and in fact, and I want this one, all those who can hear me, to take this down. We have a toll-free number. We have a toll-free number, 1559, Monja Tano Tano Tisa. 1559. It's a toll-free number from 8 to 5 every day. You can be able to call IPOC free of charge. We shall pay for you so that we can take your complaint in whatever form. We are only operating within those hours, but we hope that down the road, we shall be able probably to operate 24/7 once we get the resources. All of us have come across the UN principles and guidelines on evictions and displacement of persons. And I want these principles, for example, were mentioned by Justice Lenaona in this decision. Satros Ayuma and 11 others versus the registered trustees of Kenya Railways Staff Benefits Scheme and others. And in that judgment that was delivered by Mobingui on behalf of Justice Lenaona, it captures very well what Justice Ball was saying earlier on. But the most important thing I took from that decision is that even where our law, for example, the regulations that the judge was talking about, are found to have a gap or a lacuna, then those international principles, in line with Article 2, sub-Article 5 of our Constitution, the general rules of international law, come into play. But then you ask yourself, in this country, what have we seen? As far as the regulations have been read out by the judge, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., we know most evictions in this country take place in the middle of the night. What is the role of the police? How do police come in to evict people from private property? You know, you ask yourself these questions and you see we have a long way to go, and we need to do much more so that evictions can be carried out in a dignified way that respects the rights of the people, basic human rights as enshrined in our Constitution and international instruments, so that we can start counting ourselves in the league of civilized nations. Having said that, you also look at it and ask yourself, we have people who have lived in these lands where they are being evicted for years and years, probably some of them since independence or after independence 1963. And somebody comes and says, I obtained a title deed in 1980 or 1990. Ask yourself, is that fair? Is that just? And in most cases, no notice will be given in accordance with the regulations and the law, because these people would go to court and challenge that decision. But also remember, as I said at the beginning, most of these people being evicted are people who are helpless and hopeless. Some of them may even not have the knowledge to approach a lawyer so that they can get injunctions or whatever orders that the court can give. So I think it behoves upon all of us, IPOA, civil society, and even the National Police Service itself. Let us play our role in accordance with the law. And the National Police Service, of course, I know they would not want to engage in private matters where probably the dispute is ownership and somebody wants to cut a corner, unless probably the police officers are served with a court order telling them that they have to be there, or there is likelihood that law and order will be broken. I think the National Police Service would absolutely have no role in carrying out those evictions, other than maintaining law and order and keeping a distance and ensuring that the eviction is in accordance with the law as per the regulations that have been read by the judge. Notice has been given, it has expired, there is no court order stopping the same, etc., etc. I can go on and on, but in the interest of time, I wish to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. David Nderitu. So let me just start by summarizing what both you and Mr. Agri Juma have talked about. So Agri Juma really highlighted the two main roles of CSOs when it comes to evictions. And the first one is actually to monitor systemic policy change. And the second one is to intervene in individual cases and push for accountability when it comes to forced evictions. Something that really touched me when Mr. David Nderitu was making his presentation was the fact that you highlighted that we shouldn't look at forced evictions in an isolated manner. We should ask ourselves, you know, the people who are actually occupying this spaces illegally, why are they actually doing it? And I really loved how you broke down the different levels. So for example, the people who are, you know, very vulnerable, they're very poor, those who are there due to greed and impunity. But in the case of Kenya, at least you made it very clear that majority of the people who actually occupy this land are very poor, very hopeless, and they don't have actually other alternatives. That was very powerful for me. And thank you so much for also highlighting for us the role of IPOA when it comes to evictions. So you said you received complaints on behalf of the people who have been either mishandled by the National Police Service. You also talked about how you monitor the operations of the police in terms of professionality. And then the last one, you talked about how you investigate the conduct of the police and you submit, you know, the files to the relevant departments, the DPP. So thank you so much for this. I think it's more clear to our participants in terms of the mandate of IPOA, where IPOA can step in and where they don't have the mandate. So I'll hand over to Nelly to just take us through the Q&A session.
Yes, thank you, Lavender. I'd also like to highlight what Mr. Nderitu said, the correlation between poverty and the violation of human rights. And I think it's really important for all of us to appreciate the fact that the government really needs to look at various human rights violations and the fact that there are laws that are already there that are set to be implemented and just enforced. He also referred to Article 2 of the Constitution and even talked about how international laws and various UN principles are just already, I mean, they're already there to assist us and are already there for enforcement. So as we begin the Q&A session, I'd just like to invite anyone who would like to answer live. You can just raise your hand and we will just let you in. So we shall begin with the first question by Michelle Otieno as we wait for the live questions. I believe this question is to Agri. You talk about, no, I think this question is to Mr. Nderitu. You talk about the chain of command on police officers. Then does it mean that eviction can be tied to policies, I believe? Example, the Mao eviction, where one tribe was saying that the participants, but at the particular place, I think they did not finish the question, but I believe the question is regards to the correlation between politics and how these evictions are being carried out. Over to you, Mr. Nderitu.
Thank you very much. I think I started by saying that land issues in this country are very emotive. And when something is of such great value to a community, emotions rise and it becomes always center for so many things. In fact, the socio-economic and the politics of the day tend to gravitate towards that issue. And the Kenyans, to a large extent, attach a lot of importance to that for whatever it is to them. And therefore, let's be honest with ourselves, there is high likelihood that when politics heat up, issues of who is occupying which land becomes life. We have seen, and we cannot run away from the fact that the Mau, as much as we know is a catchment area, is a very important water tower of international importance. And we would want it to be free and to be left alone to thrive in its natural state. we have not missed an opportunity for politicians to shout from whatever head. It is these people occupying, it is that community, it is the other community. And therefore, sometimes it becomes very hard to draw a clear line between proper evictions, which are legal, and the politics of the day. Sometimes the truth and the facts are lost in between. And therefore, let's also say this. What is politics? As far as I understand, politics is about competition for scarce resources. And good Arab land in Kenya and everywhere in the world is a rare commodity. And therefore, politics and land, and therefore issues of fictions, cannot really be separated. I don't want to say, and for sure I cannot say this because it would be wrong to say that police or our National Police Service has been misused. I would not want to, I would be the last one to say that. Why? Because we know, as you put it, that there is a proper chain of command in the police, and the police, considering the entire National Police Service Act, the chain of command, Articles 243 all the way to Article 245 of the Constitution, the functions and the laws of the police are very, very clear. And there is no room for misuse of the National Police Service. And therefore, as I said earlier on, police officers in most cases will be invited to where evictions are taking place through two main ways. One, that there is a court order directing the OCPD, the OCS, or whoever else that they be at the locus to ensure that law and order is maintained. Number two, if you look at sections 24 and 27 of the National Police Service Act, the major duty of police is to protect law and property by maintaining law and order. And therefore, whenever police suspect that there is likelihood of law and order breaking, the police officers have a right, constitutional and legal and natural duty, to be at the locus. That is how you fight the police, and in those circumstances, how they, or whatever role they play on the ground, that becomes the issue, and that is how IPOA comes in. And I've explained what IPOA does if there is indiscipline or misconduct or unprofessional conduct. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Nderutu. We can have the next question to Mr. Agri. And this question is from an anonymous person, and he says, or she says, if civil society helps the government in developing policies, yet there is lack of observance of rules, should you not stop helping them and side with the public until the government shows willingness to observe human rights?
Thank you for that question to the participant. I think partnership with government is a key component of systemic change. Unless the situation has gotten so grave that we cannot sit on a table with colleagues such as Mr. Nderutu here with us and even other colleagues within government, then every opportunity that we find to reach out to government and to talk policy on issues that can change, we should take advantage of, whether or not we are siding with the public at the same time. My thinking is, and I think this has been a lot of what we have done as IJM, is that we work with community members while simultaneously working with government to ensure that what government is legislating at the high level, what we call the grass tops, is reflective of the needs of the people at the grassroots. And that is very important to ensure that laws that we end up coming up with, laws that we end up enacting, are laws that are responsive to the people. Now, when that chain is cut, when the community's needs are not reaching the high-level actors, then it is then that we have a government that is aloof of the needs of its people. And so in response to the question, every opportunity to engage with government as civil society should be taken with the seriousness it deserves, and we should take advantage of such because it ensures that the voice of the people as civil society sees it, reaches the high level, and whatever comes out of the high level interventions reflects the needs of the people.
Thank you, Agri. So we have another question by Peter Kariuki, and Peter asks, can IPOA hold the administrator in charge of the evictions in cases where the officers, such as forest officers, misuse power, thus breaching the principle of necessity and proportionality? Because as stated by Justice Bohr, a copy is served to the local administration before evictions take place. That is, for example, the OCPD. So either Mr. Agri can take this, or Mr. David Nderitu.
Thank you very much. I know Agri will have something to say about it, but let me say this by way of reiterating that IPOA's mandate is specific to the police. And therefore, we only receive complaints concerning police, monitor operations by the police, and also investigate misconduct by police. So where, for example, a provincial administration, we used to call them so, the DEOs, the DCEC, and even county askaris and the like, engage in evictions, it becomes very hard for IPOA to come in because legally we would be challenged on lack of jurisdiction or mandate. And therefore, again, also when forest guards or forest rangers and even wildlife service rangers engage in those activities, IPOA may not have much leeway in dealing with it. However, if you look at section, for the lawyers, you check at section 2 of IPOA Act, and I want to give everyone an assignment here. If you look at section 2 of IPOA Act, the definition of a police officer, it says that a police officer is defined under the National Police Service Act. And if you look at what the National Police Service Act says, it says a police officer is a person who is in active service in the police or a reservist, a police reservist. And therefore it becomes very hard. But there is a small leeway in that if any other person is carrying out policing duties under the control and at the behest of the National Police Service, then we shall have mandate to investigate them. If Nderitu, for example, joined the members of the National Police Service in the eviction, and I'm under the command of whoever is commanding those people, and I act as such and act with them, then I will be amenable to the jurisdiction and mandate of IPOA, and I will be investigated as such. That is probably a topic for an entire discussion, but I would want to stop it at that so that we understand the mandate of IPOA.
Mr. Nderitu, we have a follow-up question. So there's someone who's asking, do you think IPOA needs more sanctioning power over law enforcement to deter police brutality during evictions?
Well, I hope that the person asking the question would probably have, I think the question is, should IPOA be given the mandate to deal as well with these other people who are involved and engaged in evictions? That sounds like music to my ears. We have been asking that IPOA's mandate should be expanded so that what I called policing duties anyone involved in law enforcement then should be subject to the oversight powers of IPOA. Because when, for example, officers of the National Police Service or Kenya Wildlife or whoever else does something, and they have powers to arrest, by the way, and in the process they assault someone and that person ends up dead, or they're involved in evictions like this, and in the process somebody is beaten up or injured, and then you say, well, it is the police who will investigate. And in most cases, probably, police officers were also there. Where does that investigation go? Most likely it will not be objective. And therefore, I agree entirely with what whoever is asking the question says, that IPOA's mandate should probably be expanded so that it includes all these people and have oversight powers, investigative powers over them. But of course, that expansion also comes up with asking for more resources so that we can have many more officers, many more vehicles, many more equipment, many more, and what have you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you for that, Mr. Lewishu. I believe, Andrew, you had a comment on the same question.
Yes, I did. I think mine was on the issue of, there is two aspects to this. We have the substantive law that has to be followed whenever we are looking at evictions. And then we have the procedural law. Both have been elaborated by the Honorable Judge earlier. And so whenever we are seeing a problem at the level of violation, at the point where a violation has taken place, then as human rights monitors, as civil society, what we want to do is to look at this particular incident and try to see how fidel, if there is any fidelity to the law in how it took place. And if there is any deviation from the law, whether in substance or in procedure, then we come in on the aspect of systemic change, if the law allowed for it, or intervention for accountability, if the law expressly does not allow for it. And so, regardless of who the perpetrator would be, then for us, we would be keen to ensure that such perpetrator is held accountable and the victims find justice. So if it is the police, definitely, we will find ourselves writing letters to Mr. Nderitu's office or his colleagues. And if it is another entity, the Kenya Forest Service, we would probably look for the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights for now. And I think as Mr. Nderitu has stated, there is, and has been asked by some of the participants, there has been a continuous call for the need for expansion of IPOA's mandate to cover some of these law enforcement institutions. And that is because as late as last year, I think we went to Isiolo, and in Isiolo, their complaints against the police are minimal. The most of their complaints are with the Kenya Forest Service, Kenya Wildlife Service, and a lot of these other different entities involved in law enforcement in that area, but to which entities we do not have civilian oversight. And so they have a field day out there causing havoc to the people and victims in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Agri, for that. And okay, we'll have our final question. And this question is from Rose Kimoto. She asks, whereas we understand the obligations of the state when police violate rights in the process of evictions, what are the responsibilities of the person or entity on behalf of whom the eviction is carried out, or the beneficiaries of the eviction? I think both of you can give us a comment on the same. We can start with Agri.
Sorry, what was the last part of the question?
Okay, the question reads, whereas we understand the obligations of the state when the police violate rights in the process of evictions, what are the responsibilities of the persons or entity on behalf of whom the eviction is carried out, or the beneficiaries of the eviction?
So in part, I'll say what Senior Nderitu had mentioned. There is the issue of status, the status on the land. I think there is the issue of illegally acquired land. There is the issue of squatter situation in this country. There is the issue of land grabbing, just clean daylight land grabbing, and it varies. And so I think as someone who's facing eviction, I think the first thing that you would want to assess is your standing when it comes to that land. So that if it is land that you believe is yours and you're receiving a notice to be evicted, you have the recourse of going to court and asking the court to interpret the issue of ownership for you against whoever wants to take that land. Secondly, there are certain provisions of law when it comes to acquisition of land in case you do not have title and you're living in it unlawfully under the provisions of, I'm forgetting the term. I think it's, I'll remember it. But the law allows for you when you've been on land unlawfully for 12 years to apply to court for the land to be declared
adverse possession. I think that's what you're looking
possession.
for.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Yes. So there are such opportunities. So if you've been on land for 12 years unlawfully without the authorization of the owner, I mean, you have the opportunity to go to court and ask the court to declare this land yours. And people have done that, and the courts have declared owners as a result of that. Thirdly, of course, when the law turns against you, as far as your ownership of that land is concerned, I think as much as we are asking the police to respect the rule of law, we are also asking the public to respect the rule of law, so that whenever it gets to that point where the law requires of you to vacate, then at that point, it is prudent to find an alternative. Okay, but that does not mean that should it get to the point where you have to be removed forcefully, then the force that is used to remove you becomes unproportional or disproportionate or unnecessary under the principles that were stated of necessity and proportionality. And in that case, we would want for you to be removed with respect to your dignity and to your humanity. And if that does not happen, and something unlawful happens in the process of your lawful removal from that land, then in that case, we'd expect of you to report the unlawfulness of that procedure. Because then we also want to hold whoever is removing you accountable when it comes to fidelity to the law in the removal of an illegal occupier from land. So we are not saying they should not be removed. We're just saying they should be removed according to the law. And so the last responsibility would be making a report. And if there is any grievance that you feel as far as all that is concerned, we continue to have the law as a recourse for compensation for violation of human rights. And we have that in the High Court under the, excuse me, under the Constitutional Division. So you can always go to court and ask the court to ensure that you get compensation for violation of your rights in that entire spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Leritu, do you have a comment on the same question?
Yes, thank you very much. I think I wish to thank Rose for being a very active participant, Rose Kimotho. I think most of our problems, not only this one in this country, rise in our wanting, in our belief and resolve to live by the rule of law and to at all times observe the sanctity of justice. In an ideal situation, if there is ever such a thing as an ideal situation, I would recommend that once a notice is issued, as was very well elaborated by the learned judge, then the person wanting to evict should go and obtain a court order to evict. Why am I saying so? Because unless in what I called cases of impunity or cases of greed, I can almost tell you with certainty that anyone who occupies land that does not belong to them in terms of having a title deed, they always have an overriding reason, and therefore an overriding claim over the land. And therefore, if you go to court to obtain the order to evict, and I believe those proceedings shall be served upon the intended evictees, that gives an opportunity to the people to be evicted to come to court and explain under what circumstances are they occupying the land. You know, I'm not trying to say that if I own land, I then put upon myself a burden to prove the ownership. No, I'm only saying, can you demonstrate to the court that you have a right, you have followed the due process in terms of the substantive law, that I own the land and I have a title that is clean. And number two, that I have followed the regulations, that is a procedural justice in terms of issuing notice and complying with all what the judge was saying. The same thing was published in the Kenya Gazette, 2 national dailies, local language, all those. Once you have met all this threshold, then the court says, you know what? Have you served this application upon the people to evict? Yes. Then here is your order. Do you require police? Yes, it is included there. The OCPD or whoever will accompany you to ensure that there is law and order. Go evict these people. And then short of that, and we said this at the beginning, that issues of land in this country are very emotive, not only in Kenya, but across the world. And also, it is a matter of human rights under Chapter 4 of the Constitution. So many rights, if we are not careful, are likely to be violated under Chapter 4. And therefore, Rose, as much as I know the law, of course, law does not operate in a vacuum. Law is made by man. It is not the law that makes man, and the law must operate within certain parameters. And therefore, in my opinion, after you have demonstrated you own the land, you demonstrate that you have followed all the procedures, then you must have a court order that also gives you the security to go and evict these people. Anything short of that, most likely there will be a violation down the road. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deritu. I can see Mr. Irungu has just joined us, and maybe we can have one more question from Mr. Irungu. I believe, okay, I'm just being told that there is none. We don't have any question from Mr. Irungu, but we can proceed to give our closing remarks. Maybe we can just begin with Mr. Irungu. We can just proceed, just give out your closing remarks, and yeah, you can proceed.
So once again, thank you very much for the opportunity for Amnesty to participate both in moderating and in speaking in this wonderful session this afternoon. I think I got a short briefing of the conversations that have been happening in my absence, and I think the comments by Agri of IJM I think are really important in terms of how different arms, particularly the coercive arm of the state, the compliance or the disciplined services, how we must find a way that they are not manipulated or misused to break the law. And to violate the rights of civilians. I think this is a critical finding, and I know that in conversations with the Ministry of Interior, we have raised this issue severally, and with the Inspector General of the police, and we will continue to do that. I think the comments by David Deritu of IPOA. I think we just have to acknowledge that, where would we be now if we didn't have the Independent Policing Oversight Authority? What we've known from the last 90 days or so, or the last 5 months, is that oversight agencies, particularly in a pandemic, are critical to protecting civilians. And I think, just to note that their role continues to be critical. It continues to require resourcing, and it continues to require support from the Directorate of Criminal Investigations within the police service and the police service itself, as well as the Director of Public Prosecutions and the team that he commands. So I think this is the, I think these are two important points that we embrace about policing and the rule of law in a country like ours, where you have such large inequalities and gaps between the haves and the have-nots. And it is always going to be the have-nots that are at the brunt of the violation of our constitution. I think as Amnesty, maybe in closing, I would just say that you know, we are a membership organization. Much of our work is increasingly being done by members, and membership is is very much open to everybody who subscribes to our values and signs up to our code of conduct. So if people are interested, having heard from the work that we do, to want to continue working with us, we would love to have you as members, and you can go to our website, essentially amnestykenya.org, and just register, and you will start to get involved. We are committed to the full spectrum of the international human rights standards. We are committed to the Constitution of Kenya. In particular, we are committed to the chapter related to the Bill of Rights, and that's chapter 4, and in particular the articles on social and economic rights. So we will continue to do this work. And just once again, thank you so much for generating this conversation for 70 or more people this afternoon, and particularly during this historic Katiba week.
For joining us today, and we really appreciate for according us your time. Next, we can have Mr. David Nderitu. Just give your closing remark.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, thank you all moderators and participants and the other presenters for giving me this opportunity to share with you the few points that we have been able to share. I think Houghton has said exactly what it is, that we are celebrating 10 years since the new constitution was promulgated. And I think most of us, particularly those who are human rights oriented, are very particular and passionate about chapter 4. And I wish to state, as I have done along the way, that issues of evictions are matters of human rights in so many ways. And if not properly checked and regulated, then there could easily result in serious violations. Let us ensure, as oversight bodies, as a social, as civil society, that the substance of the law and the procedures are always followed. Law can always be amended and improved. And one area that probably needs to be looked at is the issue of notice and what happens after people have been issued with a notice. I know the wheels of justice in this country don't move as fast as they should. And therefore, if somebody has issued a notice as required by the law, and then they wait for another 5, 10, 20 years for them to, then it doesn't make sense. Probably you can see the amount of reforms that we need across our justice system, so that some of these things land smoothly. As I have said and submitted, IPOA is committed, ready and willing at all times to take whatever complaints we receive. We shall continue monitoring, we shall continue investigating and helping in whatever way. In fact, we are by law entitled to even help victims and support them in terms of compensation where there are violations of their rights by members of the National Police Service. But again, under Schedule 6 to the National Police Service Act, Part A and Part B on the use of force and the use of firearms, I think again, we appeal and call upon members of the National Police Service to ensure at all times that they adhere to those standards, both local and international. Otherwise, thank you so much, and I appreciate for having this opportunity.
Thank you so much, David Deritu, and we've really appreciated your time, and we've really enjoyed interacting with you, and we really thank you for expounding what IPOA does and how we go around this eviction processes. And to finish off, I believe we can have Mr. Agri at the moment. Juma, you can give your closing remarks.
Thank you. In closing, I'd like to say this. As IJM, we are continually honored by the repeat invitation by the organizers of AKMCC to IJM to participate. We also thank you for the work that you put in to identify very contemporary and relevant themes for discussion, and for inviting panelists and participants who are very relevant to the discussions at hand. On the issue today, in closing, I'd like to say ours is to try and ensure that we have a culture of enforcement, and specifically with the police. And in that,
Juma, for a moment. Maybe we can just continue.
Okay. So maybe as we wait for Agri to return back, maybe I can just give back the thanks to all the speakers we've had today. It's been really an insightful conversation. I thank all the participants for all the very engaging questions, and lastly, the organizers for this event. For me, I guess my parting shot would be two main things that we need to consider. One is dignity, and one is right to life. And I hope that we can continue with this conversation, because as you've seen, even though we're celebrating Katiba 10, we have a very long way to go in terms of implementing the economic, social, and cultural rights. So for me, I say thank you. I'll hand over to Nelly.
Yes, from my end, my parting shot will be, as we continue celebrating the Constitution at 10 years, we need to remember that the Constitution is a document that really champions human rights, and we all know that everyone keeps on talking about Chapter 4 and how everyone has a freedom, various freedoms and various rights that need to be protected. So I believe that we need to continually uphold the rule of law, and this is the only way we'll achieve ultimate protection of human rights. So I'd really like to thank all of you for joining us today. We've had so many participants on the call on YouTube, and we really appreciate your participation, and as well as our partners and our sponsors. Thank you so much for making this happen. We shall have the moot courts next week from the 31st of August to the 2nd of September. We know that this conversation will continue. So I think Juma has not joined, and I think that will be each. That's each from us today. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Abigail and Lavender.
Thank you. Bye.